Welcome to Concept in Medicine. In today's tutorial, we shall be looking at a confounding variable. Let's begin by looking at what a confounding variable is. When we say confounding variable, simply put, it refers to a factor other than the factor being studied that is associated with a disease and the factor being studied. So in that scenario, the factor being studied becomes the independent variable. This becomes the independent variable, and the disease becomes the dependent variable. So if we have a factor other than the factor which is under study, which has an association with both the disease, that is a dependent variable, and the factor under study, which is an independent variable, then we'll say that that factor is a confounding variable. All right, let's move ahead and look at certain derivations from a confounding variable. A confounding variable as such creates a spurious, or what we also call an extraneous, or what we call a distorted association between two variables. Which variables are we talking about here? That is going to be the disease and the factor being studied. The disease and the factor being studied would exhibit a distorted or extraneous or spurious association as a result of the confounding variable. Because of that, the confounding variable is also referred to by some epidemiologists as a spurious variable or an extraneous variable. All right. You should also know that with a confounding factor or the confounding variable, they tend to confound the true relationship between what? Two variables. They tend to confound the true relationship between what? The two variables. And the variables we know, the disease and the factor being studied, which is not the confounding what? Variable. And you should also know that with the confounding variable is able to what? Distort, as we said, distorted relationship. Distort or marks the effect of another variable on the disease being studied. It means that if you have a causative factor for a particular disease, with the presence of a confounding variable, there's going to be a distorted relationship or association between that causative factor and the disease. That's what we are talking about. So with that, the confounding variable may mask or distort the relationship between or the effect of another variable on the disease being studied. All right, let's move ahead and look at some examples which will enable us to understand the concept of a confounding variable. So we'll take the first one. The first one here, you can see the diagram here. With this diagram, we have coffee drinking, heart disease, cigarette smoking. So we'll take it this way. Coffee drinking here will be our independent variable, and we'll have the heart disease being the dependent. That's the disease. The disease is always the dependent variable. Then the cigarette smoking here will make it our confounding variable. So now let's explain. So let's take the hypothesis that is going to be coffee drinkers have more heart disease than non-coffee drinkers. That is those who don't drink coffee. That's our hypothesis. So if you are drinking coffee, it means you have more heart disease than those who don't drink coffee. It's just a hypothesis. It is not really a true statement until proven. So hypothesis is any statement that is yet to be proven. So we are creating this hypothesis that coffee drinkers have more heart disease than non-coffee drinkers. So now, in this association, we have a third variable that is going to be smoking. So the relationship between the coffee drinking and the heart disease is going to be affected by a third variable, and that third variable is going to be smoking, which is down here, cigarette smoking. It is realized that in this association, coffee drinkers tend to smoke. If coffee drinkers tend to smoke more than the non-coffee drinkers, or in another scenario, you're having the coffee drinkers smoking more than the non-coffee drinkers, then it tells you that the heart disease is not caused by the coffee drinking, but rather the cigarette smoking. So we've made a hypothesis that coffee drinkers have more heart disease than the non-coffee drinkers. That is what we are having there. But again, there's a third variable which is affecting both. That if you drink more coffee, then it means you smoke more. And in this case, if you smoke more, you have heart disease. So you can see that the third variable, that is cigarette smoking, is affecting both the coffee drinking and the heart disease. It's having an influence on both the coffee drinking and heart disease. It means that coffee drinking tends to provoke more cigarette smoking, and more cigarette smoking tends to what? Provoke heart disease the more. So in that, we'll say that the cigarette smoking becomes what? The confounding variable. Recent studies have shown that coffee drinking tends to have substantial benefits in healthy heart and also in the prevention of dementia. So what we just said is that with our hypothesis, yes, coffee drinking, or those who drink coffee, tends to have more heart disease than those who don't. But again, there's a third variable which is influencing both the coffee drinking and the heart disease. The coffee drinking being the independent variable and the heart disease being the dependent variable. And how does it influence that? In this association, that is, those who tend to drink coffee tend to smoke more, and those who smoke the more tend to have more heart disease. So you can see that the third variable, which is the confounding variable, the cigarette smoking, is affecting both the coffee drinkers and the heart disease. So we'll say the cigarette smoking becomes the confounding variable because it affects both. That's why we said the confounding variable is a factor other than the factor being studied that has an association with both the disease and the factor being studied, where the disease is going to be the dependent variable and the factor being studied is going to be what? The independent variable. So that is one of the examples. Another example is going to be here. That is, we are looking at the observed association between mortality and surgery. So let's take an example. The example is if you have an open versus laparoscopic colectomy. We want to look at mortality in those who have had open colectomy versus those who have had laparoscopic colectomy, to know which of them would have a higher mortality rate. But if you look at this very well, it is obvious that those who have open colectomy tend to have high mortality rate. And what is the reason? It means those who are having the open colectomy are those patients that were severely ill with a perforated bowel. That is why they are having what? The emergency open colectomy. Unlike those with the laparoscopic colectomy, who were not severely ill. So in that case, we'll say that there is a third factor that is influencing the mortality rate in those who had open colectomy and those who had laparoscopic colectomy. And what is that third variable? And that third variable here is going to be what? The severity of the illness. The severity of what? Illness. The severity of what? The illness. And this third factor, that is the severity of the illness, will be influencing both the mortality as in open colectomy and what? The laparoscopic colectomy. And with this third variable, that is the severity of the illness, will become the confounding what? Variable. To become the confounding variable. Because if not for the severity of the illness or the disease, the patient would not have undergone an emergency open colectomy, which increases the risk of what? Mortality. Unlike in the laparoscopic, where the severity of the illness is not high or it's mild, moderate, the laparoscopic colectomy is done, which reduces the mortality rate. So in that, we'll say that the severity of the illness becomes the confounding variable. Another way we can put it is that these are the two examples, but there's another way to relate with that. That is, if you have an association between A and B, okay? If you have an association between A and B, and the association between A and B is possible because of the influence of a third variable C. If there's an association between A and B, and this association is as a result of the fact that both A and B are affected by what? A third variable C, then we'll say that the association between A and B is what? Spurious. The association between A and B is what? A spurious one, or an extraneous one, or a distorted association. And with that, we say the third variable C becomes the confounding variable. The confounding variable. Confounding variable. I believe we've gotten the concept. Thank you very much for sitting through this lesson. Kindly make sure to subscribe to my channel, like, share, and also comment the next concept you would like to see on my channel. My name is Dr. Del, and once again, this is Concept in Medicine. Bye bye.